What's going on? It's Riffee again, here to talk to you about the second portion of our second unit, which is actually tissue. We've spent 2 video notes talking about cells, cell function, what they do to maintain homeostasis, and we've also talked about how materials get in and out of the cell, transported materials across the cell membrane, osmosis, diffusion, active transport, all of those things. Now we're going to get into the next level of biological organization, which is actually the tissue level. So this is chapter 4 in your book. We're going to try to split this into two sections. We're going to first talk about the introductory portion of tissues, and then we're going to get into the epithelial in this video, and then we'll continue with part 3 later. So even though cells are the foundation for life, no single cell can actually perform all the necessary functions for you to actually survive and live. That's why human bodies have differentiation and specialization of specific cells, so that each one of them has their own job, which in turn contributes to the one main goal of maintaining homeostasis for the entire organism. So what I need to make sure to emphasize here is that since we are going to be talking about the tissue level of organization, it is imperative that you understand that tissue function cannot happen if individual cell homeostasis is not maintained. That's the obtaining of nutrients, getting rid of waste, etc. So even though you have trillions of cells in the body, you only have 200 different types, which can be categorized into 4 different types of tissue. Keep in mind, tissue cannot function without cellular function at a normal state. So just some basic terms. When you have a collection of specialized cells, that is cells that perform one job or a specific task, or have a very limited number of functions, and they group together towards a common function, that is called tissue. Biology, again, just like human anatomy, physiology are branches of biology. Cytology was the branch of biology that studies cells. Histology is the study of tissue, coming from the word histos for tissue and logi for to study. We are already at your first entrance card question for this video, so make sure you pause the video and answer the following question on an index card. I'll go ahead and read it to you. Muscle cells rely on specific nutrients, particularly sodium and potassium electrolytes, in order to maintain proper contraction of muscle tissue or organs. Josh has been training for a marathon and noticed significant cramping of his calf muscles after a 12.5-mile run. His personal trainer informs him that muscle cramping is due to cells not receiving proper electrolytes. His muscles are cramping, yet the trainer blames muscle cells. This scenario is an example of A. Interdependence, B. Histology, C. Magic, or D. Differentiation. Make sure you get that on your index card. Here we go. So if you take all cells and you can group them into 4 basic types of tissue, the first kind we're going to discuss is epithelial tissue, but just to get through the other kinds, we're going to talk about them also just in a very, very brief amount, because I'm going to get into more detail in later videos. But epithelial, I guess you could say, is the most complex or has the most categories. It's also the hardest for most students to identify, but looking at this fantastic picture of a chimpanzee, you can notice some characteristics of epithelial tissue right off the bat. Secondly, you have what are called connective tissue. Connective tissue is the most diverse group of tissue. They have the most different characteristics within their own category. For example, anything from adipose tissue or fat to blood is connective tissue, cartilage is connective tissue, fibrous connective tissue, loose connective tissue, bone is connective tissue. In this type of connective tissue, you have things like tendons and ligaments and things like that. But if you just look at just the different functions of each of these types of tissue and just their appearance in themselves, you'll notice that it is quite diverse. And if you're looking right here at this picture again of a chimpanzee, I'm sorry, this is one of the better ones I could find, you'll notice that we are solely looking at the knee joint, and we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different types of connective tissue within there, all of them serving a specific function, but their functions come together to fit into one category of connective tissue. Then you have muscular tissue. In the human body, you have 3 types of muscular tissue. You have cardiac muscle tissue, which is the muscle of the heart. You have skeletal muscle tissue, which is going to be the kind that actually causes your body as a whole to move. And then you have smooth muscle tissue, which typically causes the movement or contraction or restriction of things within your body. Cardiac muscle cells are subconsciously controlled. Smooth muscle cells are subconsciously controlled. Skeletal muscle cells are consciously controlled, and they can be subconsciously controlled if you think of it in terms of maintaining posture or balance. And then you have neural cells. Neural cells are essentially neural tissue is in itself part of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system, brain, spinal cord, peripheral nerves that come out. We'll get into that in much more detail later. So of the 4 types of tissue, you can see they are diversely different, and again, keep in mind connective tissue is the most diverse of the 4 groups of tissue. Looking at an entire human body, you can find that they categorize them based on location and the type. You have your smooth muscle around your intestines, which squeezes food and nutrients throughout your body. You have your cardiac muscle tissue, which contracts in order to get blood pumping throughout your body. Nervous tissue, which conducts impulses or signals to travel throughout your entire body in order to control subconscious and conscious function. You have connective tissue here. This would be adipose or fat tissue right here, which stores energy, provides insulation, the typical things that you would know it does. Skeletal muscle tissue and epithelial tissue. Of all these categories, muscle is typically the easiest for kids to identify of the 3. Nervous, super easy. Connective tissue, a little bit more difficult, largely because of the diverse group it is. And epithelial tissue, in my opinion, from my experience, has been the most difficult for students to identify because there's so many specific types of epithelial tissue within that category. Just another diagram. If you're looking here, this is just one example. You have the human arm here, and within the human arm you have 4 different types of connective tissue. You have 1 type of muscular tissue, which is going to be skeletal. You have epithelial, which makes up your skin, and you have nervous tissue, which is going to control the function or provide impulses to your brain and out of your brain in order to control or respond to the environment for every single one of these other categories. Just another example of that interdependent effect within tissues. So nervous tissue controls responses of all of these other types of tissue, but then again, all of these types of tissue provide stimuli information to the nervous system, so you have that interdependent effect between all of them. Okay. Now we are on entrance card question 2. Make sure you pause this video, add it to the other question you had before on the same index card. If you run out of room, go ahead and add another index card to it. But which of the following is not a type of tissue? Muscle tissue, connective tissue, epithelial, neural, histological, or cytological? So just a little graphic organizer to kind of get you exposed to the 4 different types of tissue, and kind of we're adding a little bit of their function in there. Again, one of the main groups of tissue is called epithelial tissue. Their biggest function, or what they do, is they are going to cover an exposed surface. You can't think of this in terms of covering an exposed surface to the external environment. You have an internal environment also, and things need to be separated from each other for obvious reasons, not so obvious reasons, but we're going to dive into those more. So they line internal passageways and chambers. So you got to think epithelial tissue lines the inside of your intestine. They line the outside of your intestine. So anywhere where there's an exposed surface or environment, you're going to typically find epithelial tissue. They also provide glandular secretions. These can be endocrine glands, they can be sweat glands. All of those things are going to fall into the epithelial tissue category. So anytime we talk about glands, instantly think that they're comprised of epithelial tissue. Connective tissue, these are the things that fill internal spaces. So like blood fills the internal space of your blood vessels. They provide structural support, so think of this in terms of bone, and they store energy, so you can think of this in terms of the adipose tissue. So there's going to be different kinds. Structural support, you can also think of that in terms of like cartilage, which provides support between the bones and reduces friction, things like that. You also have muscle tissue. This is the most obvious function. They contract to produce some kind of active movement. So your skeletal muscle tissue, I'm a hand talker, and a lot of times contracts to produce some kind of active movement of my body. They call it skeletal muscle tissue because it attaches to the skeleton itself, which then, when the muscle contracts, pulls on bone and causes you to move. The cardiac muscle tissue contracts to produce active movement of blood throughout your entire circulatory system to provide nutrients and remove waste from other types of tissue. Again, thinking back in terms of that interdependent effect to maintain homeostasis. And then you have smooth muscle tissue, which again contracts to provide some kind of active movement of other various materials throughout your body, such as smooth muscle contraction is involved in excreting waste from the digestive system. It's involved in moving food through your digestive system, through your stomach, things of that nature. And it's also actually involved in maintaining blood pressure, because you can find smooth muscle around blood vessels and whatnot, so it can constrict and relax in order to dilate and control the amount of space blood has to pass through blood vessels. And then you have neural tissue. Neural tissue conducts electrical impulses. Yes, your body does have some kind of electrical current that is based on ions within your body, and those electrical impulses carry information to and from your nervous system in order to obtain to obtain stimuli information, and then send out responses to that stimuli in order to maintain homeostasis. Keep thinking, feedback loop, feedback loop, feedback loop. A lot of your nervous system is involved in feedback loops. So what we're going to dive into now is we are going to talk specifically about epithelial tissue. But what I'm going to do before we do that, I'm going to pause this video, I'm going to stop it, I'm going to let you reflect on the beginning portions of the introduction to tissue, kind of rewind, process a little bit more before we start getting really into the specifics of other things.